and tell me who you are.
Hi, my name's Sarah Hadley. I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts. I've lived in a couple of different countries, and I've also lived in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, and lived in Los Angeles for about 10 years now. I grew up in a pretty unusual place. I grew up in the Gardner Museum in Boston. My father was the director, and so we lived on the 4th floor of the museum for most of my childhood, from about ages 4 to 23. And for those who don't know, the museum is basically a replica of a Venetian palazzo. It was brought over from piece by piece. Lots of the balconies and balustrades and architectural elements were brought over from Europe, and specifically from Venice. And Mrs. Gardner put the entire museum together. She constructed it with the help of an architect, but it was really her vision, and it holds not only priceless art and antiquities, but she also has concerts there, and it's got a courtyard that is full of ever-blooming flowers all year round. She built the 4th floor as her apartment, and so the director, actually, after she passed away, the directors have always lived there up until we left, and then they turned it into offices. It was my childhood home, and it was pretty surreal and unusual to grow up in such a magical and wonderful space. I studied art in high school. I had a really fantastic art teacher. I started drawing and painting with her. I didn't really get into photography, although I took photographs on family trips and things like that. But in college, I worked a little bit for the college newspaper, and I continued to paint and draw. I was interning when I was 21 for the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, and it was there that I saw my first show of contemporary photography, and I was really blown away. I hadn't realized up until then you could use the camera as a tool of expression, and the show was incredible. It had people like Nan Goldin, the Starn twins, so that really blew me away, and I really fell in love with photography there. At the same time, when I was about 21, I wasn't really happy in college, and so my father suggested that I do an internship at the Guggenheim Museum in Venice, Italy. So I applied and I got in and I went there, and that was just transformational as well. I spent 3 months in Venice surrounded by art and with a group of international artists, and it was probably the happiest 3 months of my life, and I realized that I really wanted to be an artist at that point. So I was continuing to grow in ways, and also study art history and photograph and paint and draw. After I graduated from college, I started working in museums. I worked at the National Gallery and the Library of Congress, and then I decided to go back to school in photography after my father died when I was about 25. And it was there I studied photography at the Corcoran College of Art, and learned to print in the darkroom, and I shot film, and I began working for small newspapers, photographing, and also exhibiting my work. I was always working on projects, the first of which was a project about people on the subway going to work in DC, because I was going to work a lot of times and I loved the light and the architecture of the subway. So I started photographing there, and from there I evolved into various other projects. I moved to Chicago and continued shooting there and shooting for newspapers and magazines. In about 2005, I really decided I wanted to do a project about the city of Venice, Italy. It also really echoed my childhood home, and I wanted to do an homage to the place. And also it was really an homage to my father and to a lot of the time we'd spent there. When I was a kid, because of his job, we went to Venice quite a bit, and I always found it just an incredibly interesting and mysterious place. In 2005, I got on a plane and I went to Venice and I started shooting. It was in November. It was during sort of their rainy season, and there was lots of fog, and it was dark, and I would shoot from morning till night. And one day I was out in photographing and in the fog, and this man appeared in front of me walking over a bridge who looked so much like my father that I really felt as if I'd seen a ghost. And that really just became the seed of the project, and it started me off on this project that I now call Lost Venice. So Lost Venice was really this personal vision that was talking about the loss that I felt about my father's death and the loss of our childhood home, which we moved out of when I was 23, and also just the loss and impermanence about Venice, because of course Venice is built on ocean water. The foundations of most of the buildings are actually chains and wood pylons, so Venice is not only sinking, but it's slowly being eroded by the salt water and the sea. So it's a perfect place to talk about impermanence and change.
So how did you end up in Los Angeles?
I came here with my ex-husband, which is not a glamorous story, but he's an actor and he always wanted to move here. I actually got a job here working for the Time Out Los Angeles Guidebook, and we moved here for a couple of months just so that I could shoot that guidebook. And after that, I just loved it here, actually, and we had friends here already, and so I just decided to stay. I think the art scene is incredible here, and it's just blossoming, and I love the sunshine, and yeah, I really took to Los Angeles.
What was one of your first experiences with a camera?
I was given a camera when I was probably in, middle school somewhere. When I took pictures with that, I still have, it was like a little Instamatic, and I have the pictures of, my dolls and, various things. But I actually took a darkroom class when I was in 7th grade with a teacher, and I really loved that. I mean, seeing the images appear in the fixer was just, in the developer was incredible, and then, I just was hooked by the darkroom.
How do you feel about the digital age?
I embraced it pretty early on. I have to say I spent a lot of time, because I worked for small newspapers, and I spent a lot of time in poorly ventilated darkrooms, and so I was happy to step out of the darkroom. I love the digital darkroom. I love using Photoshop. I do love the look of film still, and I do want to go back and actually scan a lot of my old film images, but and so I still take film. I still shoot Holga, and I shoot some images on a Rolleicord, an old Rolleicord that I have, but in general I've embraced digital, and I think it's incredible.
For the Lost Venice series, what is your process? You walk around the streets, or you do photojournalism, or talk about that?
So the process really was that I shot from morning till night, kind of, as I said, trying to find these sort of hidden corners and these dark alleyways and ethereal moments in Venice. And then I brought them back and I edited them using Photoshop and using other software to try and give them the look that I wanted, and also sort of the feel, and to evoke what I wanted to say.
Talk about the next series in your life, storylines.
My first real love was cinema. I mean, I watched films incredibly when I was a kid. My parents met in Milan in the 60s, and so we spent a lot of time in Italy when I was younger, and I watched a lot of black and white foreign films, and I was really struck by the female characters and how strong they are. In Fellini's films, even though the male characters are dominant and they come from this sort of macho society, the female characters like Sophia Loren are incredibly strong, and they're incredibly beautiful. And then the surrealism from, Man Ray and Magritte, I love surrealism, and I also sort of put in a little bit of Rauschenberg there, the collaging. So I started just putting images together in the beginning to create a narrative, to create a story and a film, basically, but in a single image. Talking about female identity, talking about just sort of the interior landscape and how we feel about things, and how, our desires, and especially as we age. So it has sort of morphed from black and white into color, and actually using some of paintings and drawings that I've been doing over the years. Sometimes I re-photograph the images and I put them in the end product, the black and white image, and sometimes they end up in color, and I've used sort of torn images, but always from my archive. I've been a photographer for 25 years, so I have a vast archive of images, and I wanted to use them to express these sort of interior stories.
Talk about the Gardner project.
So my latest project is talking about my childhood at the Gardner Museum, and I've been going back there for the last 3 years and photographing, again, sort of the way I did the Venice series. I just spend entire days in the museum. I photograph the light, I photograph the dark corners, I photograph sort of what I remember. I'm not, sort of interested in, most people go there, and it's sort of like Venice too. Most people go to Venice and they just are, overwhelmed by the beauty of it, and they photograph these grand vistas, the Grand Canal. The Gardner is the same way. I'm not overwhelmed by it because I lived there for so long. So I'm really sort of interested in sort of what's there but what's not there, and what people see and what people don't see. It's been really interesting to reflect on my childhood there because, as I said, I was 4 when we moved there, and only now I'm starting to think about what it was like. And most people think of it, oh, it was splendid and beautiful, which it is, but it was a bit like growing up in an Edward Gorey novel. There were headless statues and sarcophaguses in the garden where I played. When you walk into the museum, there are 2 lions, and there's a man trapped under one of the lions that he's clearly about to devour. I mean, it's this ancient statue. What that meant to a 4 and 5 and 6-year-old, I don't really know. I mean, I can imagine. One of the most famous paintings in the museum is called The Rape of Europa, and it is the myth of Zeus turning into a bull and then carrying off this young maiden. And while it's a celebrated photograph, it really is pretty horrifying to think of what it's saying and what the message it's delivering. So I really am back there kind of trying to think about how the creepiness and the strangeness of the museum also seeped into my consciousness. And I've been able to go back into the archives, which has been incredible, to read my father's correspondence. Because we lived there, all of his correspondence came to the museum. I mean, the difference between his public and private life was a very slim margin. And it's been wonderful because I've just, got to read everything he talked about, which also brings up memories of people that I knew, of people that he talked about, of people that came to visit us and stay with us. It was also a much smaller museum then, so we would go to England in the summer. My mom's British, and we would go visit my grandparents, and he would write to the assistant director things like, how are the Red Sox doing, and have you heard from the kennel about our dog? And it was a very intimate correspondence in some ways, so I got to hear my father's voice again. I've also been researching Mrs. Gardner, who I knew about, but I didn't really realize the influence that she had. I'm struck that she named a museum after herself at a time when women didn't even have the right to vote. The money came from her family, but also from her husband's family, and they had conceived of the project together, but he died, and she called it the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and it is her museum, and that's pretty evident. And there's also a lot of paintings of women in the museum, a lot of wonderful paintings of women. So she really was celebrating her femininity, and also what she knew. She studied art history herself. She went back to school, having never gone to college, at Harvard, and would sit in on lectures and learn about things. And she was really an eccentric character. She brought in to her home, apparently women were not allowed to go to boxing fights at the time, so she brought in the boxers and privately had a little party for her women friends and had the boxers fight in front of them. She's also apparently borrowed lion cubs from the Boston Zoo, and apparently walked down Commonwealth Avenue with them. So she was she was incredibly wealthy, but incredibly eccentric.
Lastly, is there any other places that you'd like to photograph?
I'd love to photograph everywhere I go. I mean, I've been going to Paris the last couple of years, and as I said, I have this strong affinity to Europe, so a lot of Paris has shown up in the Storylines images. I'm also was interested in New Wave cinema, so I looked at a lot of that, and that has sort of infiltrated those images. I'm drawn to things that are antique and old, I think just because of my childhood and because of my history of spending a lot of time in Europe. But I photograph in Los Angeles too, just at the Huntington Library a couple of weeks ago, photographing with a model there. Again, because it is reminiscent of Italy, and it's the only funny thing about it. I love Los Angeles, but it doesn't have a lot of these old places that I really like to photograph. But I spend a lot of time editing here, so that's great too. I mean, I sort of have very concentrated periods of photographing, and then I have very concentrated periods of editing and collaging and working on images in my studio.